Welcome to the Word for 2022. We just finished the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. The books that follow now are 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The books of Chronicles actually reiterate what we just read in 1st and 2nd Kings, but you will find a little more detail. As you read for the book of 1st Chronicles, it begins with the tribes and the clans, names of those that are listed that made up the nation of Israel. You will find descendants and genealogies. The book also goes back over how David became king and his life as king, and how he wanted to rebuild the temple of God. So, as you read 1st Chronicles, you will see how he prepared for the temple to be rebuilt. And then you will read a list of names once more. You will read about the genealogy of the Levites, divisions of the priests. You'll see the names of the singers, the gatekeepers, and the officers. And then you will read all that David gave to rebuild the temple of God. The book of 2nd Chronicles then details the life of Solomon, how he built the temple and what he did as king. It then talks about the kings that followed after Solomon, how they were unfaithful to the Lord, all that they did, and then how God sent Israel and Judah into exile. But instead of going back over all of those kings in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I want us to go to the book of Ezra. Ezra deals with how the nation came back to the promised land. As you begin reading the book of Ezra, the Israelites, they're freed from exile and they're coming back into the land. Now the book of Ezra, it's not about the prophet Ezra. In fact, he doesn't even come on the scene until chapter 7. Rather, Ezra focuses upon God and what God is doing, how God keeps his promises, how God moved upon people's hearts, and how God is sovereign. At the time of the exile of Judah, which were the southern tribes, we read about that in 2 Kings chapter 25 and 2 Chronicles chapter 35 and 36. God moved upon the prophets to speak to the people. He used the prophet Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and Ezekiel. God even spoke a promise through Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 29:10, God said, "When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place." The Israelites were placed into exile, but then God said after 70 years, he would bring them back from exile. After Israel, the northern tribes, went into exile, God then spoke a promise through the prophet Isaiah. And in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, God said, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus." And then in that same chapter, verse 13, God said, "I will raise up Cyrus. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free." Isaiah chapter 45 was written 176 years before this prophecy was fulfilled. Now in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, this is what we read. "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved upon the heart of Cyrus the king. And because he did, then the king set the exiles free and even returned the articles that belonged to the temple. He returned what was taken from God's house." As we read the book of Ezra, there are 4 truths that I want you to see. First is that God is faithful in keeping his promises. What God says, he will do. The second is that God is sovereign over all. He is sovereign over time, over circumstances, and over people, even kings' hearts. The third truth is that God will provide. At just the right time, God provided freedom, he provided resources, and he provided favor to his people. And the fourth truth that you will see is that God is Lord over all. He is Lord over everything. He knows the future. And God knows every person, even those that are not yet born. Because of that, God knows where you are, and God knows what you are dealing with. And because God holds the future, he wants us to trust him, to follow him, and to obey him. Thank you for joining the Word for 2022.